Okay, good afternoon everyone. Hope everyone's having an amazing Monday. Now before I start today's video, I just want to do a foreword, making it very clear that this video is in no shape or form meant to disrespect anyone of any particular race or language group. This video is not to say that Mandarin, Tamil or Malay are in any way inferior languages to English. And the same goes for any of the Chinese dialect groups, which I unfortunately was not gifted. Malay, Chinese, Tamil, Hindi, and so on are all parts of the cake lapis that form the society of Malaysia. Each of them has an important role to play in the diversity of our country, and none should be disparaged. English should not be disparaged either, yes? So, of course, what I'm trying to say is that there is no language that is inferior to any other. But having said that, English is still the best glue, in my opinion, for uniting the Malaysian masses. Watch my video with an open mind, and perhaps you will understand where I'm coming from. This video is not meant to say that that any of these languages are inferior to English, but rather to emphasize the fact that English, though a British colonial language, can indeed be a powerful unifying tool for the Malaysian masses. So this video is not meant to denigrate any Asian or African languages. This video is certainly not to promote the superiority of the English language, but merely to show you how English, despite being a colonial language, can ironically be used as a powerful tool to unite the Malaysian masses. I want to say thank you to Kalamenko, one of my commenters, for providing much needed constructive feedback. So I was incorrect in believing that English was the most widely spoken language across the board in Malaysia in the 50s to 70s. So that was my mistake there. According to Kalamenko's rectification, English was in fact the language that was spoken mainly by the white-collar intelligentsia, and most people in the rural areas did not have access to English language schools, which provided the most holistic form of education to Malaysians, objectively speaking, in the 1950s and 1960s. So that is some constructive feedback that's much appreciated. You see, guys, I don't mind constructive, respectful feedback, but if you come at me in a disrespectful way, like when you say, "You're stupid, learn Chinese," or "You're a disgrace to the Chinese," or "You're a disgrace to Malaysia," well, then that's not a very intelligent way of putting forward your arguments, and your points will simply be discarded. But if you have a disagreement with me and you want to bring it up in a respectful way, you're welcome to do so. And if I think that you make sense, I'm willing to shift my position. In any case, my policy has always been about promoting goodwill, harmony, and respect among Malaysians, regardless of what language they may or may not speak. So, for example, if a Chinese Malaysian doesn't speak any form of Chinese whatsoever, that person only speaks English, you ought to respect them as much as you respect someone who speaks 4 languages. Just like I would expect you, as a normal person, to respect a gardener as much as you would respect a university professor of political science, would you not? At least the gardener ought to be treated with the same degree of respect, in the same way the banana ought to be treated in the same degree of respect to a Chinese speaker. And likewise, I have also made it very clear that, yes, I'm not really in favor of this idea that, some people promote that, oh, it's fine if you don't know Chinese, but you live in Malaysia, so you've got to know at least some Malay. Yes, Malay is indeed the most widely spoken language in Malaysia by people across the board. But I disagree with people who say that it's fine if you don't know Chinese as long as you know Malay, and that your citizenship ought to be revoked if you don't know any Malay. That too is a somewhat bigoted perspective, in my opinion, because we are all Malaysian. We are all Malaysian from the moment we were born till the day we draw our last breath. As long as we consider ourselves Malaysian, we are Malaysian. As long as we participate in society and respect other Malaysians and treat everyone with respect, no Malaysian is less Malaysian than another, regardless of how Malaysian they might be. Does that make sense? So no, I'm not in favor of sidelining or isolating anyone who does not fit the mold of anyone's expectations. Does that make sense? I think that we're all Malaysians and we should respect each other and consider each other's feelings and tolerate each other. That's always been my message, even though my message has been twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Yes, indeed. To quote Rudyard Kipling, my message has been twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. I am accused of breeding hatred against Chinese speakers, when in fact I'm only saying that there should be no hatred against Chinese people who don't speak any Chinese and have no intention to learn. That is all. And yet my detractors will twist my words to make a trap for fools, because that is what they do. They strawman my arguments. So anyway, yes, I also think that while Malay is an important language, the fact of the matter is that no one should be ostracized or isolated just because they don't speak it. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin the video. Good morning from the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day. Today, I'm going to talk to you on the topic of lingua franca, or medium of education. And in this video, I argue that English ought to be the lingua franca of Malaysia across the board. Are you ready? Let's go. So a couple of months ago, I ruffled the feathers of a Chinese-American ultra. We were arguing over politics, but somehow this fellow decided to bring in ethnic identity politics and basically try to lambast me, because apparently a Malaysian Chinese who can't speak Chinese ought to be ashamed of himself. Yes, as if that was going to hurt my feelings, although considering that neither my grandfather nor my grandmother was able to speak Mandarin or read Chinese, and I'm a Peranakan, so I consider myself Nusantara first and Chinese second. This insult was like throwing water on a duck, basically. But in any case, there's a common assumption, a misguided assumption in fact, that all Chinese Malaysians are able to speak and read Chinese. There are some of us who don't. I mean, if you think about it logically, if you did not go to a vernacular school and neither of your parents reads Chinese, how would you read Chinese? Use your brain for a second. But in any case, there are some who also believe that Chinese Malaysians who don't read Chinese or speak Chinese are not normal. They are abnormal Chinese. These are the Chinese ultras that I'm talking about. But did you know that a great many Chinese people throughout the 1950s and 1960s in Malaya did not read or speak Mandarin? Yes, the great many Chinese people in Malaya in those days sent their children to government schools. because government schools offered a less parochial and more holistic education. And the fact of the matter is that government schools were so great that parents generally preferred government schools over vernacular schools before their standards plummeted in the 70s, thanks in no small part due to Dr. Mahathir as the education minister. In the 70s and 80s, well, the standards of government schools really plummeted. And I've said before that if you want to outmode vernacular schools, well, you simply need to buck up the standards of government schools. But that's another topic for another day. Today, I make the case for English being the lingua franca of Malaysia, because we are far, far too linguistically divided, and with the current state of things, everyone is basically going their own way. Let me explain. For example, if you were to step into an office in Malaysia today, you would see people of different races all speaking a different language to their own clique. So, the Malays will be speaking Malay, the Chinese will be speaking Mandarin, and the Indians will be speaking Tamil. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with all of these three languages. They're all important languages in their own right. But, having said that, the fact of the matter is that we can't ignore that Malaysians are far too culturally divided, and nobody can agree on one cohesive Malaysian identity, because everybody is so obsessed with identity politics. And I don't say this flippantly, I really mean it. For example, as I've said before, the Chinese ultras, for example, even if they speak fluent Malay or English, will exclude people who don't speak Chinese in their circles, right? So that is what I mean by identity politics, when you exclude people who don't speak your language. And the reality is that we were not always like this. You can blame racial politics as part of the problem, which has caused people to feel polarized and create their own bubbles. But one other thing that you have to blame is the fact that these bubbles have been allowed to crop up in the first place, because there's simply no enforcement of one common lingua franca for everybody to use. Yes, we do use Malay in government offices. When we go to government offices, for example, we do speak Malay. But when we are at work, or when we are, just walking around town, basically, everybody seems to speak a different language. Take, for example, the country of Italy. While it is true that the Italians have a very, very firmly entrenched culture that is very well known worldwide for pasta and pizza and beautiful women, the fact of the matter is that Italians are not a race, nor are they an ethnic group. Italians are a diverse mix of different ethnic groups, such as Celts, Romanians, Greeks, Arabs, and so on. But they all fundamentally identify as Italian first, and whatever ethnicity they are second. And America, I hate to be saying this, but according to the American ideal that is promoted by America's defenders, all Americans ought to identify as American first, and whatever ethnic group they are second. So America also aspires to be a nation like Italy. But if you notice that in Italy, for example, or America, everybody speaks Italian or English, respectively. Now, whether or not they speak their purported mother tongue And I find it extremely disrespectful when when some people in Malaysia, especially the Chinese ultras, say, I have lost my mother tongue. Well, you can't lose something you never had, because my mother tongue is English, right? That's what my parents spoke to me. That's what my grandparents spoke to me. So everybody, despite having a mother tongue, or despite speaking their mother tongue, speaks the same language, Italian or English, so that everybody can be understood. And regardless of everybody's differences in political stances or personal beliefs, everyone agrees that they are Italian, and they have a common identity that's not fragmented like India. Malaysia is a very fragmented country. You could blame race-based politics, and I do like to apportion some of the blame to race-based politics. But you can't blame race-based politics like affirmative actions for the majority or 15% housing discount for Malays. That is part of the blame, but you cannot put all the blame on race-based politics, because it takes two to tango. The fact of the matter is that there is also a very, very strong sense of identity politics, especially in the Chinese. It's not wrong to say that many people who promote the Chinese ultra mentality do feel that their culture is superior to the culture of the Malays and the Indians. So while they don't mind if a Malay or Indian does not speak Malay or Tamil or Hindi, they get very upset and very angry if a Chinese person does not speak Chinese, because they consider it a rejection of their 5,000-year-old civilization. And that, to me, is also part of the blame. Part of the fact that a rising China that is rising again has given some people from the white-collar strata of the Chinese Malaysians a big head. And that's why I'm saying you can't blame the Malay nationalists completely, even though they are partly to blame. It takes two to tango, yeah? You can call me a Ridwan T, it's fine. I've been called worse things than that. I once matched with a young lady on Tantan, and I was very surprised that she actually right-swiped me because I'm a banana. And on her profile, she specifically wrote, "Bananas swipe left," which is very, very specific, because if you prefer to speak in Chinese, well, you could just say, I prefer to speak in Chinese, but this felt more than a little personal. And so I decided to text her and say, hey, your profile does seem like a fuck you to bananas. And she said, okay, bye. So this is what I mean by the cultural polarization that you cannot blame on the Malays, because it's a very popular thing to assert that if only the Malays would be nicer to the ethnic minorities. And I agree that affirmative action ought to be based on class rather than race, but it's very popular to assert that if only the Malays were nicer to the ethnic minorities, then everybody would get along and everybody would be nice to each other. But the reality is, even if our country were like Singapore, for example, these people, like this individual I talked to, would still exist because they consider themselves higher, not only to the Malays or the Indians who don't speak Chinese, but also to the bananas. So the reality of the matter is that we have become so polarized that there are people who are so entrenched in the culture war that they ignore the class war that's going on right now. That's why I'm saying we need a common identity, a common lingua franca and a common national identity that we all speak in our daily lives. You know, that's what I am trying to promote in this video. This individual did not hate bananas because bananas were oppressing the Chinese or bananas were being unfair to the Chinese. Because bananas are Chinese as well, right? This individual simply hated bananas because she thought that bananas were less human than she was. And that is why I'm saying that Malaysia is so polarized, it's such a polarized country, and it really takes two to tango. So the fact of the matter is that until we come up with a common identity where we see each other as Malaysian first and whatever ethnic group we are second, then we will always have these problems. You know, I think we were going very, very nicely in the 1950s and 1960s. The GDP of Malaysia was almost double that of Singapore. Even until the 1970s, Malaysia was a much more prosperous country than Singapore. And do you notice what Malaysia had in the 1950s and 1960s under the premiership of Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman? It was a cohesive Malaysian identity. Regardless of race or religion, everyone used English in the national schooling system. And we were on a very good trajectory throughout the 50s and 60s. Then what happened? Well, you had right-wing Malay leaders who started injecting racial and religious identity politics into our education system. And although it's a very popular notion that basically making the syllabus Malay from English, it's very popular to assert that that was done in order to give the Malay students a leg up compared to the Indians or Chinese. I don't agree. I think that this choice of reverting back to Malay was a political move, basically, by well-meaning but misguided leaders in our country in order to basically instill a sense of national pride. Because the logic was basically that if the Japanese can use Japanese in Japan and the French can use French in France, why can't we be proud of our national tongue as well? And it seems like a very reasonable proposition. Yes, after all, if the French can use French in France and the Japanese use Japanese in Japan and the Chinese use Putonghua in China, why shouldn't we also take pride in Malay? And why shouldn't we also treat Malay as the uniting language of Malaysia? Well, the fact of the matter is that I hate to sound like a wet blanket, but Malay is not the language of business, science and technology on an international level. On a local level perhaps, but as I've said in my previous video, we already put the lingua franca as Malay, and this caused our standards or our English standards to rapidly decline over the past few decades. France, Japan and China can have their own native tongue as the lingua franca because those are already prosperous countries that have developed a certain economic stability that they are free to chart their own course. But we can't afford identity politics. We have to be pragmatic, and the most pragmatic thing to do would be to use English, the language of Shakespeare, Milton and the Bible, because English is still, whether we like it or not, one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, and the language that is most likely going to help you when you do business on an international level. And of course this will trigger the Chinese ultras, but the reality is that most people in the world do not speak Mandarin. Yes, there are people in the Western countries who are learning it, and yes, naturally, if you were born in China, you would likely speak Mandarin. But the reality is that Mandarin is not likely to overtake English as the language of business, finance and technology anytime soon. It will not overtake English as the international medium anytime soon, simply because it's too difficult a language to learn. You often hear right-wing, Malay right-wing ultras going on about how, the minorities have got to speak Malay if, for example, they are to call themselves Malaysian. And I think that most minorities, including the vernacular educated Chinese and Indians, already do speak Malay. Many of them at a considerably higher level than I do. But they still don't consider themselves to be fully Malaysian in many cases due to the policies that they feel have put a boot heel on their throats. But also due to the fact that, we haven't formed a very clear idea of what being Malaysian is. We haven't formed a clear Malaysian identity. And that is what is basically causing all this tribalism, all this polarization, because everyone is going their own way. And as much as I respect Mandarin and I respect Malay, I am a pragmatist as well. And I know that English, as of now at least, is the way to go. Because you cannot make a living off Malay on an international scale. That's not to deny its importance in this country. But having said that, English should still be the medium of education as of now. Because English is the most pragmatic language, since we already have a very good foundation as a result of the British. In the time of Tunku Abdul Rahman, for example, most Malaysians spoke English to each other, believe it or not. Yes, if you talk to boomers who grew up in the 50s and 60s, you will know this for a fact, that most of them spoke some English at least, if not fluent English. And that is the result of their English schooling. And basically, boomers, believe it or not, if they didn't go to, if they weren't indoctrinated, are far less likely to be ultras than this generation. Because boomers were lucky that they had a holistic and wholesome education. And I want that for other Malaysians as well. The British were not nice to us, but they did leave us with a very, very important unifier. And that is the English language, because the English language is the most neutral sort of language, that does not involve racial identity politics. Because if the ultra right-wing Malay nationalists demand that the Chinese and Indians speak Malay at all times, this is perceived by the Chinese and Indians as having a big brother relationship, like you are acting like the Tuan Tanah or the landlord of this country, and we are basically bending the knee to you and your culture. And if the Chinese say, okay, Chinese should be the lingua franca of Malaysia, there are people who even say that if you live in KL, you should speak Chinese. I've been told that by people. So this is also not a feasible option, to make Chinese the lingua franca of Malaysia. First of all, because you're not going to motivate most Malaysians to learn it just by saying that it's a beautiful language. Oh, there are so many beautiful languages in the world. Italian is beautiful, Spanish is beautiful, Arabic is beautiful, but I doubt most of us would want to learn those languages if we didn't have to. The fact of the matter is that, no, Chinese cannot also be the lingua franca of Malaysia, even though Chinese is a very, very widely spoken language. And China is rising once again, simply because it will take at least 100 years for all Malaysians to be fluent in the language. First of all, no, the Malaysian Indians will not agree with it. And second of all, it's a very, very difficult language because it is a pictorial language. English, no matter what you say about it, has been successful as an international language of trade and technology. You know why? Do you know why the top universities in the world are Oxford, Harvard, and Cambridge? Because English is the most practical language with which the brightest minds can function. Yes, the English language is basically the most practical language to express scientific and philosophical and artistic terms because of its simplicity, unlike Chinese, which is a pictorial language. Yes, this is a very unpopular idea, but it's true. And that's why Chinese will never overtake English as the international language, at least not in our lifetime. So no, I'm not in favor of Chinese being our lingua franca either. Okay, but I also think that putting Malay as the lingua franca of our education system basically sets an unspoken big brother, little brother relationship, basically. I'm not downplaying the importance of Malay. Malay is a very important language on a local scale. If we are to communicate with all of Malaysia, we do need to know Malay. No one is downplaying the importance of Malay. But having said that, if we do not master the English language, then we will not get very far on an international level. Because it will be at least 50 to 100 years before we ever master Chinese as a nation. But, as I've said, we already have the English foundation. You know, just like the Persian poet Rumi once said, "Why do you run from room to room searching for that diamond necklace which is already on your neck?" We already have the key to our salvation, the key to the salvation of this nation, to make this nation a great nation. And that is the English language that we should master to its max, so that we will not only take revenge against the British by speaking their language better than they do, but also put ourselves on an international map rather than a local map. I want Malaysians to think internationally and be internationally competent, not just locally competent. I don't want us to be jago kampungs, I want us to be jago antara bangsa. And I believe that English, since it is a neutral language, will be a most suitable form of lingua franca for our education system because it does not involve ethnic identity politics, and it does not basically promote the importance of one ethnic culture in this country over the other. Although, to a certain extent, I suppose you can say Malay ought to basically be taught to everyone in this country to a certain extent so that everybody can understand each other. And you know, no one gets to look down on anyone if they don't know their so-called mother tongues, or if they're not Chinese enough or not Malay enough for their taste, because we don't have a tribalistic sense of identity, but rather a cohesive one, just like an Australian sense of identity or an Italian sense of identity, when everyone speaks the same language and nobody is higher or lower than another person, because on earth as it is in heaven, everyone is imbued with the language of Shakespeare, Milton and the Bible. And if you're concerned about people losing their mother tongue and becoming a dirty banana like me, God forbid, well, you can always, have mother tongue education in schools. We can have options for Malay or Chinese or Tamil, which means that people will not lose their so-called mother tongue. But I do think that in in society or in public, it is considered reasonable. It is reasonable to expect everyone to speak a language that everyone understands. And just as I would not speak English in front of a Malay person who does not understand English, there are very few, by the way, I would try and speak in Malay. I do think instituting the English language will be the first step towards ending linguistic and cultural polarization. Because when we all speak the Queen's language, we can't be polarized linguistically, at least. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.